Poy Sippi, Wisconsin, 1957 or thereabouts. A woman was staying over at her mother's house, sleeping in the spare bedroom, when suddenly she was awakened around 1 in the morning by the feeling of someone yanking the quilt from off the top of her. As she defended the blanket, she realized that she was actually in a tug of war with some unseen force. Now, as this realization set in, she heard a loud voice say, "Give me my Christmas quilt." Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am just another tinfoil hat, and welcome to a very special edition holiday episode of Just Another Tinfoil Hat. Now, today we will be discussing the absolutely fascinating case of the Ghost of Christmas Quilt. Now, before we begin, a brief segue just into some, I don't know, Yuletide nostalgia. I remember being like super little. I don't know how old I was. And there's this one song and I am totally blanking on the name of every single Christmas carol that I've ever heard. But it's like, they'll be dead, whatever. And scary ghost stories is one of the lines in the song. And I remember being a kid, remember this very clearly, and being like, okay, holiday tradition, let's hear some ghost stories. And I found out at that point that apparently it's not as widespread a tradition as the song leads people to believe. To tell ghost stories around some open fire. There wasn't even an open fire at my grandma's house in Platteville. But in spite of the lack of chestnuts and fires and, I don't know, carriages or whatever, um, my grandma and my aunts humored me and told me some stories, general folklore from southwestern Wisconsin, the by even then familiar tale of the Nodal family incident, which I covered on my channel, or the Mineral Point Phantom, as well as some, personal experiences that they had had throughout their lives. So, kind of in honor of that, here is a very, seasonally appropriate tale of a purportedly haunted quilt. Now, the owner of this polter quilt, this quiltergeist, this haunted quilt, for lack of a better term, was a woman by the name of Dora Monroe. She was 61 in 1963 when all of the newspaper articles about this quilt came about. Now, she and her husband had purchased their Poy Sippi residence back in 1955, and apparently it had come with a scattering of random furniture and other household goods. Now, she found the quilt sometime in 1957. She claimed that it had been just folded up in a box, left in a corner of the house, and so she finally uncovered it 2 years after moving in. The quilt was a classic crazy quilt pattern in black, yellow, and red with yellow stitching, and was likely sewn in the 19 teens or 20s. So she saw the quilt, decided she liked it, and spread the quilt over a bed in the spare bedroom. Shortly thereafter, her daughter Florence came to stay over. Now, Florence slept in the spare bedroom when, suddenly she was sleeping peacefully. Suddenly, between midnight and 1 in the morning, she was awakened by the feeling of someone just gruffly tugging the blankets off of her. She responded by grabbing onto the quilt, and a tug of war ensued. It was at this point that she realized that there was no one on the other end of the quilt. She was simply in a tug of war with some unseen force or the quilt itself. Now, she then heard a voice in the room say, "Give me my Christmas quilt." And although frightened, she actually continued hanging on to it. She wouldn't give up on this quilt. She continued hanging on to it for roughly 3 more hours until it finally quit moving and she could go back to bed. More house guests would come and experience the bizarre antics of this so-called crazy, crazy quilt. A woman and her daughter claimed that while staying over at the Monroes, they slept in the spare room and witnessed the quilt wiggle around on the floor, become extremely warm or extremely heavy. Mrs. Monroe's daughter-in-law claimed that when she used the quilt, she heard a heartbeat noise emanating from it. Now then, two of Mrs. Monroe's grandsons also tested the quilt themselves one night. One slept with the quilt on the couch while the other stayed awake trying to see what was going to happen. Around 1 in the morning, the boy who remained awake claimed that he saw the quilt rise above his sleeping cousin, then fall in a heap on the ground. Now, supposedly moving the quilt from the house simply moved the activity with it. One of Mrs. Monroe's granddaughter's boyfriends took it to his home in Winnicona, Wisconsin. He apparently snuggled up with the quilt and fell asleep when, sometime after midnight, he was awakened by the quilt moving. He vacated the bed and sat in a chair, watching as the quilt straightened itself out, almost as if it was making the bed. As he was transfixed by this scene, he suddenly heard a knock at his front door. The boyfriend left the quilt by itself to go answer the door. I guess dead of night, there's a knock at the door, you have this possessed quilt, whatever, and saw that his visitor was none other than a faceless man in a farmer's hat. Now, apparently it was raining that night, but the man's clothes were completely dry. He turned and walked away, leaving no trace. Now, at the time of the last major reporting on this possessed quilt, Mr. Monroe was the most recent person to have used it, and he supposedly lasted 3 or 4 nights. Even though it moved around, he kept at it and wouldn't give up until one night when he finally just decided to let go and see what was going to happen. The man claimed that as soon as he let go, the quilt flew to the floor and crawled underneath a dresser. After a brief stint in California to be tested by some of Mrs. Monroe's relatives, the quilt was back in Poy Sippi and held to the rigorous testing of a group of 6 women, including 2 of Dora Monroe's neighbors and a reporter from the Oshkosh Northwestern, but not Dora herself, who had a heart condition and just didn't want to risk it. Now, I know the suspense is probably very, very great for you all right now, but as the Oshkosh Northwestern said in their title of this kind of final word on the haunted Christmas crazy quilt of Poy Sippi, well, anyway, it's warm. Nothing anomalous happened. Now, I love this case, and I couldn't resist using it for my holiday special. Now, a word of skepticism first from, the little Scully peanut gallery of my mind. I do think that the claims of a heartbeat and the quilt being exceptionally warm or exceptionally heavy are kind of difficult to pin down as truly anomalous. Just with the fact of covering up with something, sometimes your own heartbeat can kind of echo and sound louder than, you might think it should. And especially too, if you've been asleep and then you wake up, your sense of temperature and strength can just always be kind of off. So again, I think those are kind of, a little hard to pin down as strictly anomalous. Now, that being said, I feel like the rest of the pieces of this quilt story definitely have some weirdness to them. Now, the fact that there were multiple accounts of different people sleeping with this quilt and then roughly around the same time every night being awakened by the feeling of it being tugged off of them is very intriguing to me. What's even more intriguing to me is that out of these people, at least 2 of them, Mrs. Monroe's husband and daughter, actually tugged back. Just to imagine kind of, yeah, you wake up and you feel like someone's pulling the blankets off of you, and so you just kind of pull back, and then it's just this unseen presence. I think that's very odd, and also too, it kind of it lends a little bit more reality to that experience. The fact that it was a sustained, length of time that they were in this tug of war over this quilt with some unseen force. Now, the quilt moving of its own accord, especially kind of crawling on the floor, reminds me of many traditional poltergeist cases where objects behave as though they literally kind of have a mind or a kind of life of their own. Now, the strangest part of this case to me has got to be the faceless farmer. One of the first things that stands out to me in that kind of portion of this case is the detail that although he was standing out in the rain, his clothing was completely dry. This calls to mind another classic Wisconsin story, that of the Nodolf home, where 2 children seemingly were apported out of their house in the middle of the storm, and when they came back inside, even though they had been out in this kind of torrential rain, they were totally dry. This too kind of goes on a kind of a little tangent, I guess, into cases where people say that they'll see UFOs that appear to be unaffected by, like, if they go into water or if it's extremely windy out, they're just completely unaffected. It's almost as though there's some sort of projection onto this material plane as opposed to something that is affected by it. Now, the fact that this midnight visitor was also faceless is extremely odd. Faceless entities are one of those just absolutely bizarre things that I love keeping an eye out for. And again, this is one thing that shares, you know, countless sightings across every different type of paranormal phenomena, whether you're talking about UFOs, whether you're talking about ghosts, whether you're talking even about, Sasquatch or other cryptids. Now, the fact that this entity literally came up and knocked on the door is also, I mean, absolutely bizarre. It's odd to me that, when this crazy quilt, everybody who knew of the phenomenon around it believed that it was somehow the nucleus of these anomalies. And so as soon as it's moved, you suddenly have this strange faceless being in a kind of, almost mundane shell, that of like a farmer's outfit effectively, approaching the place where it was taken. Again, is this actually the case of some entity or some, spirit attached to the object, or are the witnesses' anticipations informing kind of the dressings of these anomalies. Kind of regarding that too, whether our witnessing of the phenomena changes it in some integral way, or at least changes its image. There's also this kind of frustrating example of how each time the quilt was tested, nothing happened. It does seem as though there's a very just irksome non-repeatability to anomalous encounters. It's that old song of, oh, sure, the one time I didn't have my phone or I didn't have my camera was when I saw fill in the blank. It could be a ghost, it could be a UFO, it could be Bigfoot, man wolf, some nameless being from beyond the stars. I don't know. However, the enduring mystery of this crazy quilt is also this. I really wonder what became of it. Like, is it folded up somewhere in someone's basement or attic, or is it sitting on a bed in some cozy bed and breakfast somewhere? And if that's the case, are people still waking up in the middle of the night to engage in a tug of war with some unseen force that demands their Christmas quilt back? Well, if you enjoyed this episode on the Ghost of Christmas Quilt, please like, and if you're new to this field of crop circles, go ahead and subscribe to see what weirdness the future may have in store. Till then, you can keep up with me on my free blog at patreon.com/justanothertinfoilhat. For today, I am Zelia Edgar, and whatever you celebrate, I wish you a weird and wonderful holiday season. Signing off.
Do